how far have we gone since the adoption of the UNGPs in terms of uptake from companies of these newly defined duties? This question, this is the subject of our reflection today, right? How far have we gone and where we're going? Naturally, in the last decade, interest and ability of companies to carry out human rights due diligence, and I'm stressing these two elements, interest and ability. We'll come back to these different distinct aspects of the challenge. The interest and ability of companies to carry out human rights due diligence has been very uneven within and among regions. Today, we will obviously zoom into South Asia, because it's the South Asia Forum on Business and Human Rights, while acknowledging that because of the global nature of supply chains, developments in one region greatly influence the evolution of the discourse in another. This is also why we have so many speakers with us today who are not from the South Asia region. Now, in this regard, following legislation on modern slavery adopted by Australia and UK, in fact, before by UK in 2015 and then by Australia in 2018, some governments, mostly in Europe, have recently adopted or started to develop legislation on human rights due diligence. Some have also placed in focus environmental due diligence. France, Switzerland, Germany, Norway, and the Netherlands are some examples of countries that have adopted already legislation. Importantly, the European Commission recently published a draft directive on corporate sustainability due diligence that will require business above a certain size to conduct human rights and environmental due diligence to address their adverse impacts on human rights, labor rights, the environment and climate, including in supply chains, right? So this is, I mentioned obviously supply chains because that is why it is important to this region as well. So we will discuss today this rapid evolution of the discourse and its impact on South Asia with an esteemed panel of experts and practitioners. And indeed with all the participants whom I invite from now to raise their hand if you are in Dhaka, or post your question in the chat if you are tuning in virtually, if you have any question. Now, join me in greeting the panelists so I can introduce you to them all. Some are joining from the stage in Dhaka and some from the virtual floor. I will first introduce all of them and then ask them to present or respond to a question one by one. So perhaps if they can help me, those virtually, to have their camera on. I do see they have it on, and maybe they can wait when I call their name. So those tuning in virtually can match your name with your face. And the same would happen with those joining us from Dhaka. Let me start by introducing Professor Dorothy Baumann-Poli, Director of the Geneva Center for Business and Human Rights at the University of Geneva. Thank you, Dorothy, for joining us. Then let me introduce Jeremy Opritesco, Deputy Head of the EU delegation, in Dhaka, in Bangladesh. Thank you very much, Jeremy, for joining us. And I'll go then to Mr. Mohammed Kabir Humayun, who is the Joint Secretary of the Ministry of Labor and Employment. If you perhaps nod or wave, Mr. Humayun, there you go, so people will know who you are. And then let me go to Nusrat Khan, who I know is joining us from Dhaka. Nusrat Khan is a business and human rights specialist in our office, UNDP office in India. Thank you for joining us, Nusrat. I'm unsure whether Mr. Fasi ul Karim Siddiqui has already
Livio, we can't, sorry, Livio, we can't hear you very well.
Join us. If he is there, can I? Sorry, my connection is a bit unstable. I hope I'm audible now. Am I audible now?
Yes, you're audible now. Mr. Fasihul hasn't joined us. We are trying to connect him. I think we can give you an indication when he joins.
All right, so let me introduce you then to Emily Sims, who is the help desk coordinator at the ILO support desk for business. Emily, there you go. Thank you, Emily, for joining us. All right, so now that I introduce you to the panel, and I do hope to ask maybe 2 questions to each of them if there is time, but I will, in any case, make sure that there is time for questions from the participants. So allow me to start a conversation today by calling, so to speak, on the virtual stage, Dorothy. Again, Dorothy Bowman from the University of Geneva. Now, Dorothy, you are obviously a very close observer adopted around the world. So as you will kick off our discussion today, and given some of the participants may be less familiar than others with the very concept of human rights due diligence, I would like you to summarize the discourse around human rights due diligence in the last decade, perhaps with an emphasis on this discourse in Europe, and then share your initial reflection on how the adopted and upcoming norms are likely to affect businesses in South Asia. The floor is yours, Dorothy.
Thank you so much, Livio. Not a small question. It's a pleasure to be with you today. I've traveled to Dhaka many times, and it's great to at least join you virtually today. So human rights due diligence, Livio already outlined the context, the UN guiding principles for business human rights as they were adopted in 2011 were based on 3 pillars. And the second pillar, the corporate responsibility to respect human rights, has human rights due diligence as its core concept. Livio said it's the most exciting pillar and has advanced substantially in the last decade. So what does human rights due diligence actually mean? I'm a professor at a business school, and to us, it's a management system that allows companies to proactively assess their human rights risks and impacts and take appropriate measures to address them. So it's a way to systematically integrate human rights in everyday management processes. And often the human rights due diligence process is broken down in different phases. It all starts with a clear policy commitment to human rights. Then companies are asked to assess actual and potential impacts. Then in an additional phase, they are asked to integrate and act on the findings of the risk assessment. They will have to track the responses and make sure that they engage in remedies so that they communicate about these impacts and how they've been addressed. So these are sort of the key components of a human rights due diligence process. It sounds very simple and straightforward, but as always, the devil's in the detail. Doing this in practice is actually very difficult for large companies that operate in over 100 countries, deal with many different jurisdictions, and often have incredibly complex global supply chains. So in Europe, the notion that globalization shouldn't be a race to the bottom, and we no longer want to accept sweatshops in the supply chains of large multinational companies has led to a hardening of this soft law requirement. So human rights due diligence, as it came out in the UN guiding principles, was a soft law requirement. Now it's hardening in that more and more national jurisdictions have been taking it up and ask their companies to put it into practice. For example, in France, there's the Loi de Vigilance. In Germany, they've enacted last year the German supply chain law, and they now make this human rights due diligence process mandatory. And most importantly, despite these national efforts, is a process at the level of the European Union the European Parliament approved a proposal in March last year, which they then sent to the Commission. It's currently under discussion still, but in the process. And it's been a difficult process because there's a lot of discussion about what should the scope of such a requirement be for companies, to which type of companies should it apply, and then also what is the accountability mechanism, should there be civil liability, etc. To me, I'm not a legal scholar, and I invite you to explore all those details. For example, with the speaker of a previous session, Miriam Sage-Maas, this is her daily bread. She follows all those details. For me, I'm a management scholar. I think it's most important to understand some things on the horizon. Things are already required from some companies that operate from certain jurisdictions like France and Germany. And companies are simply better advised to prepare now. It just makes better business sense. Even if not everything that currently civil society organizations hope for will be put into law. But I have shown through my research that it just makes good business sense to take human rights due diligence seriously and work with other companies to develop actual industry-specific standards that further clarify the broad guideline of human rights due diligence. So, Livio, to your last question, how does this impact business in South Asia? So certainly it means, irrespective of what will eventually come through this European process, that companies need to have supply chain transparency. They need to be able to map their supply chain. From my research, I know that alone is already a major challenge for many companies still to this day. It also has to do with the fact that some companies have business models which set clear incentives for suppliers to find smart compensation strategies to be able to comply with the brand's expectations. So, for example, in the garment, in the apparel industry, an industry I've studied closely in Bangladesh, we've seen that as prices for apparel are falling and lead times are shortening, the suppliers in Bangladesh are able to comply because they can rely on a network of subcontractors. This is a smart business strategy, but from a human rights risk assessment perspective for brands, not ideal because they often have no insights into those deeper layers of the global supply chain. But to address this and to effectively map all layers of the supply chain, brands at the top need to reflect critically on the incentives they set through their requirements to actually effectively address, for example, subcontracting. Second, I think one impact will be that to assess risks, companies need to engage with a broad range of stakeholders. And to me, there's hope in this human rights due diligence requirement that the approaches that have been used to establish, for example, labor rights in global supply chains do become more inclusive and more participatory. Because without the key stakeholders at the table, it's virtually impossible to adequately assess human rights risks, let alone address them adequately. So to me, it opens up an entirely new space for more systematic stakeholder engagement. And I hope that in the future, governance structures like they've been put in place with, for example, the Bangladesh Accord, where key stakeholders were not part of the governance structure, namely those manufacturers, will not happen in the future again. It would not be adequate to leave them out. Let me also share 3 fears that I see with the human rights due diligence process becoming more prominent also legally in Europe. I'm worried that treating human rights due diligence as prescribed by the Ruggie model and the phases that I outlined earlier will lead to more treatment of symptoms. As I mentioned, how important it is to map the supply chain, understand what drives the complexities in some of those supply chains. I already highlighted the importance to understand how business models affect human rights down that supply chain. And I think it's actually perfectly possible to go through the moves of human rights due diligence without critically reflecting on the business models and those incentives that it evokes. And so I'm worried that, again, we're probably just superficially treating symptoms. Another limitation I see with human rights due diligence is that it's primarily concerned about preventing harm for people. But I'm at a business school, and I also would like to explore opportunities. There are plenty of studies that highlight if you treat workers better, they are more loyal to your company, they can be trained, then productivity increases. And it's this positive upward spiral that I would love to see further emphasized also through human rights due diligence. And so it can't just be about preventing harm, but also about opening up new business opportunities. And then last, probably my biggest concern is that now that it's become a legal requirement, human rights due diligence is often shifted to corporate lawyers within those multinational corporations. And they, of course, also only see risk. And if they feel that the remediation of a human rights risk is too hard, they might advise for the company to leave. And this is a real concern that I think we should all have an eye on, because it's certainly not in the spirit of the UN Guiding Principles to then cut and run once things become more difficult. One requirement of the UN Guiding Principles is to proactively seek out ways to enhance leverage. Individual companies that are currently engaging in their own private journey on, for example, establishing labor rights in global supply chains, I think are well advised to now finally look for allies and develop clear standards that are measurable. It's one requirement of the human rights due diligence concept. The last portion of that process is also to show and tell how risks have been addressed. This requires measurable standards and certainly greater leverage that can only come through collaboration. So I'll stop here, but I would love to say a few more beats on the important role that I think multi-stakeholder initiatives should play in further defining human rights due diligence in practice. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dorothy. What a great kickoff of our discussion. Great background. I mean, you mentioned 5 or 6 elements, each of which would probably deserve a discussion of its own. I should just perhaps pick on a few things that for me stand out. The difficulties in mapping of the supply chain. I'm glad that you balance your message sort of standards and actual practical aspects of carrying out this due diligence, looking at it also from a point of view of the company. So the issue of the difficulties in mapping supply chains is particularly relevant in this discussion, in my view. So is the aspect around incentives from big brands. Obviously, equally relevant, the issue of a systematic stakeholder engagement, which new norms are encouraging. Lastly, you pointed out 3 challenges. So again, each of which would deserve a dedicated discussion. And we'll probably perhaps go into that towards the end. If we get a chance to ask you another question, I am indeed interested in your views on multi-stakeholder engagement, also particularly interested in your point around treating symptoms rather than making it. Again, we'll hopefully come back to you. In your presentation, Dorothy, you made references, I did in my background, to the norms around environmental and due diligence that are being.
Livio, we are losing you. You may want to switch off your video.
Will be offered you soon by the. Yeah, let me switch off my video so it's easier. Perhaps my connection will be a little stronger. So with regards to the, EU norms that are to be introduced, we're very lucky to have with us today the deputy the EU delegation to Bangladesh, Jeremy Opitesco. And thank you, Jeremy, for support the European Union is extending to us and has extended in the last 2 years and 2 more years to go a partnership for the implementation of the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights in 7 countries, not including Bangladesh at this stage, but including 2 other countries, focusing 2 other countries in South Asia, India and Sri Lanka. Now, the recent normative developments championed by Brussels are obviously giving great impetus to the entire global discourse around human rights and environmental due diligence. Interest in some regions is skyrocketing. I'm really witnessing that in certain parts of Asia. I actually received today a report on a webinar we broadcasted last week on environmental and human rights due diligence and developments in Europe. In only 5 days, it was watched 6,000 times. Now, I'd like you to reflect and tell us a bit on the motivation of the EU behind the important policy action. Why has the EU, like several of its member states, decided to propose and adopt legislation on human rights and environmental due diligence? The floor is yours, Jeremy. Thank you.
Yes, good afternoon. Thank you very much, Livio, and thank you very much for the ILO, the UNDP, and other UN agencies for organizing this very important topic on this major subject. As you said, Livio, there is a new element, there's big actuality in the EU about this topic with the adoption, with the proposal, actually 1 month ago by the European Commission of its new directive. This was 23 February 2022. So that's very new element, very much expected. And before asking to a question why, I would like to give 1 or 2 elements of the upcoming process on this directive. Now the proposal is supposed to go through the European co-legislators, the European Parliament and the Council, which is representing, as you know, the governments of our 27 member states. Then we expect a robust debate during probably 1 or 2 years until the directive is adopted. Once the directive is adopted, this proposed instrument will have to be implemented in each of the 27 member states, and each member state will have 2 years to implement this directive and to enforce its implementation. So that was for the process, for making it in a few points. Then coming back to your question, why? What was the motivation of the EU in adopting this directive? I will have 2 or 3 simple and key elements for answering to the question. First, there is a very clear political context in favor of this directive. We all know that companies play a key role in creating a sustainable and fair economy and society, but in this purpose, they need support in form of a clear framework. From the EU perspective, the EU has various international commitments, as you know, the SDGs and the Paris Agreement, which the EU is very keen to implement, to deliver, but it has adopted as well a series of key strategies which are guiding EU's action, and in these strategies, due diligence and sustainable value chain is very much present. I won't go, of course, into the strategies, but just to mention the names which are very important for us: the biodiversity strategy, the action plan on circular economy, the farm to fork strategy, the EU action plan on human rights and democracy, decent work communication 22, and trade policy review 2021, amongst others. In addition to these strategies, which are really structuring the EU's action, and in which, as I said, this topic is very much present, the EU, the Commission had a very strong call from stakeholders to take action and to draft this directive. Both the Council in December 2020 and the European Parliament in March 2021 asked the Commission to submit a legislative proposal on a mandatory value chain due diligence and a sustainable corporate governance. Finally, the third kind of impetus was coming directly from the civil society and for the companies who called the EU Commission for action. The EU launched a series of surveys with very interesting results. For example, a 2020 preliminary study on due diligence, in which around 70% of companies who participated expressed themselves in favor of a harmonized EU legal framework on due diligence. Then a consumer survey was carried out in 2020, and more than almost 80% of the consumers interviewed indicates that the sustainability was a very important topic for them. And then there was in 2021, for preparing the draft proposal, we had a public consultation in which we got more than 500,000 responses, which is a very significant number. The second reason why the EU drafted this law, this directive, I won't go into the details because it was mentioned before by Dorothée. This voluntary frameworks which are existing and the voluntary actions of the companies are very laudable, but we noticed that even if from a survey 1/3 of the companies are taking action on a voluntary basis, we know that they often stop at the first level, as was mentioned just before, while we know that problems occur more down in the value chain. So there was a kind of strong incentive to have a mandatory framework for on this topic. And then, as Livio and Dorothée also mentioned, we had in Europe several laws already in France, more recently in Germany, in Netherlands. Other member states had more specific sector-oriented laws or on specific topics. So that was a kind of challenge for the companies who had not in our single market a kind of let's say harmonized framework for taking action. So these are the reasons I wanted to mention, Livio, for answering to your question. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Jeremy, for the clear messages. Thank you, in fact, very much for the reference to the SDGs, obviously very dear to UNDP and not only, and reference to the Paris Agreement, both being sort of at the root of the decision of the Commission to adopt those norms on human rights due diligence, along with the strong call from the stakeholders. Stakeholders is a word that we very much like, and I'm glad that within the stakeholders you included obviously companies, and we've all seen many companies, in fact, coming in support of these norms as a way also to level the playing field. I also note, and I hope other participants have noted, that there is still some time until these norms will kick in. However, time is somehow starting to tick. And so as Dorothy said before, companies better start preparing soon. Now, let me turn to, I'll come back hopefully to you again, Jeremy, and there may be questions for you. But let me now use the opportunity to call in the virtual forum a representative from the government of Bangladesh, Mohammed Kabir Humayun, who is Joint Secretary of the Ministry of Labor and Employment. And thank you for joining us, Mr. Kabir. Now, stricter norms around compliance for European companies, what we've just heard, will have an impact on suppliers, including those in Bangladesh. Now, I'd like to know from you, how do the points made by the first two speakers speak to the government of Bangladesh somehow? And what are those existing initiatives that the government of Bangladesh is working on to prepare businesses in Dhaka and other parts of Bangladesh to manage the possibly greater expectations from them in terms of human rights due diligence? The floor is yours, Mr. Kabim.
Okay, thank you. I think what I have learned from the previous speakers, I believe that this emerging human rights and due diligence law will bring positive changes in the supply chains in Bangladesh. There has always been lots of pressure on our suppliers to comply with labor standards. The human rights and due diligence law come in and place responsibilities to large business in the destination countries as well. So I find these emerging laws will help shifting the power dynamic in the supply chains, in the sense that buyers will now need to take more active roles in working hand in hand with suppliers in improving social compliance on various aspects. At the same time, there is a lot to be done to understand more on the impact of the laws on business in Bangladesh and what they do need to do prepare for this trend, especially when Bangladesh has a strong trade relationship with countries in Europe and North America who are very strongly linking human rights and due diligence in business. We may need a study on these. It is important to make sure that business from here will still be competitive and attractive suppliers. We do not want business here to lose the trend. If business can meet the standards and maintain access to markets and grow their operations, this means more decent jobs for people will be created in Bangladesh. I'd like to stop here. If I need, I can intervene later on.
Thank you very much for a very crisp and clear presentations. I very much I appreciated, in fact, your welcoming comments on the norms that are being adopted in the supply chain that is connected with the Bangladesh, and I'm glad companies, from what you said, will be able to enjoy support from the government in preparing for what's to come, with a view of finding a balance. That's what I understood from your words, and I very much agree, between respecting human rights while, of course, remaining competitive, which is perfectly understood as an objective also of companies. So thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mr. Kabir. Again, hopefully we'll come back to you later as well. I'd like now to have an opportunity. We talked a lot about companies, to turn to the views of the private sector in itself and go to Mr. Fasiul Karim Siddiqui, who is the senior advisor of the Employers Federation of Pakistan, and also part of the UN Global Compact Network, Pakistan. Mr. Fasiul, you join us a little bit later. We've been having a discussion around human rights, due diligence norms in other regions that will impact South Asia. And I'm sure you are aware of the developments that are taking place in Europe, and not only, but mostly in Europe with regards to human rights due diligence. Now, how aware are businesses in South Asia of the trends around hardening human rights due diligence, as one of our speakers put it today? So how aware are the businesses in South Asia? Are they receptive of the idea of responsible business? Do they see opportunities, or do they have concerns, or perhaps both? So over to you, Mr. Fasio.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon. I'm sorry for being slightly late because of technical reasons to join the meeting, but I've heard Kabir and other speakers, and I think it's a very opportune moment and the very ripe time to discuss the change in the environment that is taking place in business, particularly in South Asia, and Pakistan is one of those essential countries where a lot of change is taking place in terms of emphasis on human rights and environmental stability. I think three things are significant to observe. One is the changes in laws and standards. There is a strong need and a strong tendency towards channelizing laws to meet the challenges of human rights and particularly the decent work agenda. In Pakistan, after the 18th Amendment in the Constitution, the provincial governments have been made responsible for labor laws, and we are passing through a phase of revamping our labor laws to bring it in accordance with the requirements of the national standards and international labor standards. Employers Federation of Pakistan, for that matter, has played a very pivotal role in working with the social partners in bringing clauses relating to human rights and risk mitigation in the provincial laws, which has been a very, very fruitful exercise in coordination with the social partners. The second important thing that is affecting the region is the need for health and safety to be incorporated in the human rights framework in a manner that it is able to meet the challenge of the post-COVID scenario. And I think nothing more could have been the outcome of the COVID scenario that particularly South Asian countries and Pakistan in particular has been conscious of bringing some fundamental changes in the health and safety framework at the enterprise level. And this is one of the dynamic impact which COVID has made on enterprises. And I think it is one of the realization of a very important aspect of human rights. While at one point, human right, health and safety is going to be included as the 9th core labor standard convention in the fundamental rights category. I think enterprises are being more and more conscious of the need to train their managers and workers in the challenges of health and safety. Employers Federation of Pakistan has been doing that for the last 16 years. We are possibly the only organization in the region which has now been recognizing companies with best practices in health and safety for the last 16 years, every year. And so far, about 500 companies have been recognized for their best practices in health and safety. And this is serving as a great replica for many other companies to follow the suit, particularly after the incident of Ali Enterprises, in which about 200 lives were lost in a textile company in Pakistan. I think there is a lot of shift of emphasis of enterprises towards ensuring a health and safety environment in the enterprises, and it is improving day by day, although challenges still exist. The second important thing that is taking place is the inclusion of the supply chain in the globalization initiative. And I think throughout the region, as also in Pakistan, now the inclusion of supply chain in the efforts to expand the canvas of human rights diligence mechanism is very, very important. Employers Federation of Pakistan has taken at least 3 initiatives in this respect, which could be worth noting. The first was working in the sports goods industry of Sialkot, where in the post-COVID scenario, we have been able to train 500 management and worker representatives in areas of productivity improvement, quality improvement, industrial relations, and particularly fundamental principles and rights at work and the M&ED principles. This has been a great experience because companies after the COVID scenario were finding it very difficult to rehabilitate themselves out of the crisis. But I think Employers Federation's initiative of going to companies and training their people in areas where they had lost their connections and connectivity is a great reaffirmation of the consciousness and resilience of the companies towards their mitigation of risk towards human rights contraventions. And I think that's a great. The second important thing is bringing the agricultural sector within the canvas of the labor laws and the human rights diligence mechanism. Employers Federation of Pakistan once again has done a very important job in establishing trade union of workers, farmers, and trade union of landlords in the agricultural sector. In the province of Sindh in particular, we have formed 5 small landlords association, and similarly farmers association was formed, which did not exist before. And this is a great step towards number one, mobilizing the agricultural workforce towards decent work. Secondly, building up the mindset of agricultural landlords towards entering into collective bargaining with their farmers on improvement of productivity. We have been able to conduct like few productivity training programs in order to help these trade unions of farmers and landlords to implement productivity program in their farms. And the outcome of these negotiations and the productivity gain will be shared in the form of improvement in social protection. The third important thing that is happening is universalization of social protection in Pakistan. I think that's a trend which has emerged in the last few years in the region as well, where the social protection canvas has to be universalized. Unfortunately, so far it has remained confined to industrial sector, and the bulk of informal economy had been out of the social protection. But I think a great initiative has already been taken and has started in bringing the informal sector first through extending the benefit of social protection. And for that, the initial dialogues among social partners have already started taking place. The next important thing is...
For wrapping up soon, please. Thank you.
Sorry. The last important thing that I would like to say is a focused study on lower tiers of cotton supply chain in order to bring an improvement in the working conditions, wage structure, and social protection clauses. And that again is a shift in emphasis, which has been the need of the economy and social drive, particularly in view of the GSP plus requirement. So I think having taken into consideration a lot of initiative, social protection, social working conditions, wages, infrastructure, and the overall standard compliance are the areas in which there is a great shift of emphasis in Asia, South Asia in particular, and in Pakistan. We are taking a lot of initiative to highlight these factors as the driving force to be able to combat the challenges of the future of work and the challenges of the new decade of the current century. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Faizul, for bringing in the voice of the business sector and doing it with a positive spin and with welcoming views on the upcoming due diligence norms. Thank you also for pointing to normative developments that are taking place indeed in Asia as well. It's not only Europe. You mentioned some of the developments in Pakistan. I'm sure that the next panelists will talk about the guidance on human rights due diligence that the government of India has adopted. I should point to the norms around human rights due diligence that are to be adopted in Japan, again, a big actor in Asia. So there's really a lot happening in this field of human rights due diligence. Thank you very much again, Mr. Faizul. Let me now give the floor to Emily Sims, who is the ILO Help Desk Coordinator. Thank you for joining us, Emily. And let me use the opportunity to thank very much ILO as a co-organizer of this forum. Now, in all this discussion, Emily, we haven't heard much yet about the role of the MSMEs, which traditionally is human rights compliance is more complicated and are confronted with an additional layers of challenges sometimes. So, how do you think, Emily, South Asian MSMEs will be impacted by human rights due diligence obligation? What can they do to prepare? Right, we have heard this prepare sort of warning coming in for many of the speakers before. How do we apply that to MSMEs? How can they prepare? How can they ensure that the burden also on this compliance is shared fairly across the supply chain? The floor is yours, Emily.
Thank you, Livio. And hello to everyone. I'm very happy to be here with you and to have a very interesting and lively discussion. Coming at the tail end of the platform, a lot of great things have already been said, but I have the privilege of reinforcing some of those and explaining how they relate to smaller enterprises. So it's no mystery to everyone that due diligence is really being driven by global supply chains. It's not exclusively that. There are many organic initiatives, and I'm the manager of the Help Desk for Business, and I engage with companies every day. And I can tell you there are small companies that are doing things just because of their faith, values, or other motivations that are completely outside global supply chains. But the reality is most of it's driven by global supply chains. And that's not a bad thing. We have to start somewhere. But the challenge in terms of small enterprises is that global supply chain buyers, managers of supply chains, buyers, they're not engaging directly with these smaller enterprises for the most part. They typically source from extremely large or occasionally medium-sized enterprises, but very rarely small and never micro enterprises. Those only come into global supply chains through, as Dorothea mentioned, subcontracting relationships from the first tier supplier down, or perhaps companies that are sourcing locally for particular inputs. But then that means the nexus between due diligence writ large and that small enterprise is that first tier supplier, which poses some challenges. First of all, even the very sophisticated large ones are still dealing with quite a few challenges themselves. This is a fairly steep learning curve for a lot of companies that are really new to a lot of these issues. I must say, I'm only speaking now about the world of work, because that's my area of expertise, but I think it probably is even more foreign to them thinking about externalities that are causing human rights violations for people in their communities as well. It's just not normally how companies think, although it's changing. But so one of those things is it's a steep learning curve, even for that first tier supplier, even if they're quite sophisticated, and many of them are quite new. And so it really is a steep learning curve. So there's a lack of capacity in doing it themselves, but especially turning around and coaching and mentoring their next tier down, which is the cascading model that so much of human rights due diligence depends on. The buyer deals with the first tier supplier. The first tier supplier then in turn takes responsibility for supporting the second tier, the third tier, on down. That's called the cascading model. So a lack of capacity is a big deal. But the other big deal is something, again, Dorothea had mentioned in her remarks, is that very often what happens is due diligence is the spotlight looking out at what your partners are doing. And the spotlight doesn't necessarily or typically get reflected back on the buyer and what they're doing that's putting pressure on the supplier. So those first tier suppliers, to alleviate their pressure, they're alleviating it through their subcontractors. So you're putting them in a conflicting position, having done nothing but impose obligations, and then expecting them to live up to those obligations and then turn around and then with their pressure valve now cut off in effect to be able to manage. That conflict is very difficult for them to sustain, and we shouldn't be putting them in that position in the first place. So I'm going to pivot from talking about companies. I think they have important responsibilities, but they're not the only ones here. It's also governments that have very important responsibilities in this area. So first of all, I'm going to talk to home country governments. These are where buyers are headquartered or where the destination markets reside, about their expectations around due diligence, and to really re-emphasize the message that due diligence is not just about minimizing risk, either by avoiding it, by boycotting particular countries, please don't ever do that, or by engaging with businesses in different countries that maybe have risks, but yet not supporting those businesses, not only by helping them to understand their obligations and to help improve their management structures, but it also entails reflecting back on yourself. What are you as a buyer doing to try and alleviate pressures in the first place? But that's not enough, because the vast majority of micro and small enterprises and even medium enterprises are not even in global supply chains. So if we want to reach them, it's got to be a bottom-up host country obligation as well. And I think they actually need to be truly in the driving seat. So this means in your national action plans, it's great that you talk about human rights due diligence. It's great that you talk about the importance even for micro, small, and medium enterprises, but that is not enough. Dorothy, again, made mention of it, but she was saying it's the after effect when she was talking about productivity. I want to plead with you very passionately that it is the foundation. It's not the after effect. It's not what comes later after we've dealt with human rights. If we do not address the costs, and from the ILO, it pains me to admit it, but it is silly for me to deny it, that if you tell a company that they need to pay the living wage, or even just the minimum wage instead of the prevailing wage, that company will be gone in 6 months if you don't address the costs. Mr. Siddiqui very rightly talked about the importance of social protection and occupational safety and health. Those are going to increase costs. That's not a reason not to do them, but it's a reason for us to be hyper-focused on how we're going to support these companies to realize and absorb those costs without just collapsing, because that doesn't do anything for the companies and it doesn't do anything for those workers in the companies. So we have to embed human rights due diligence in broader management systems that help them remain productive and competitive. Sorry, I feel so passionate about that, but I feel so passionate about it because otherwise we're wasting our time. So my plea to you as governments in South Asia, you have a wonderful gem in your neighborhood called the Asian Productivity Organization. It's an intergovernmental organization. It just focuses on supporting companies and government institutions, by extension, to increase their productivity. And we have done work. I myself have done joint research with the APO on the link between workers' rights and productivity improvement, completely outside the framework of business and human rights. It was simply how to better manage companies and the link between how you treat workers and productivity improvement systems. And there's a very strong link. But how much better if we can have a collaborative relationship between South Asian countries, many of which are members, India, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, Nepal, Bangladesh. I'm pretty sure I'm missing a couple of countries, but there are many of you that are already members of APO, and others that are probably very much welcome to join, and I would encourage you to, and to have a joint project just on productivity improvement and human rights due diligence. What is the interlinkage in terms of research, in terms of policy prescriptions, in terms of actual action programs to support small and medium enterprises? And last but not least, you actually have an important resource in your employers organizations. Mr. Siddiqui, who has been a great partner for my unit in particular, we've done a lot of work with the Employers Federation of Pakistan. They are tremendous resource because especially for micro and small and medium enterprises, these are their core members. So they have the incredible network and outreach, and I would really encourage you to make great use of them. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Emily. Your passion, for the genuine passion for this, I really think came across. Thank you for delivering it with so much passion, enthusiasm, almost, I would say. There is a number of governments that I'm sure are tuned in. I hope they will listen to the plea, and I'm sure they'll be connected with you and your offices of ILO. Thank you for illustrating the complexity of human rights due diligence when it comes into the practical aspects of it, especially when referred to micro, small, and medium enterprises. Again, your message was very clear on productivity improvement and human rights due diligence going hand in hand. Thank you very much, Emily, for that. Let me turn to the last speakers, and as I do that, I'll encourage once again people in Dhaka or listening to us virtually to send questions. We do hope to have a little bit of time for questions to be posed. But let me first turn to the last panelist. Is actually a dear colleague from UNDP, Nusrat Khan, who is a business human rights specialist in UNDP country office in India. Nusrat, UNDP works a lot on awareness raisings. It provides human rights due diligence trainings in many countries, including yours, where you work. But this work has just started. We realize that there's a long way to go. What gaps do you see among South Asian companies when it comes to understanding and properly conducting human rights due diligence? I'd like to have once again, the practitioner sort of view of somebody that works at the field level. Over to you, Nusrat.
Thanks, Livio, and I hope you're doing well. Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure being here and to talk about some of our experiences from the field on human rights due diligence training. Of course, I mean, over the past few sessions, even yesterday, we've had some South Asian businesses operating in South Asia talk about conducting human rights due diligence as part of their business operations. It's something that they're developing a structured way of conducting human rights due diligence, and they've also sort of taken the pandemic as an opportunity sort of to introspect and to do business in a way which is responsible, to do no harm. In fact, one of the speakers actually mentioned that the idea is not only to do no harm, but is to proactively do good. And in doing so, put in place structures that can sort of be respectful of both internal and external stakeholder rights. And they also spoke about how human rights policies have been sort of put in place by some of the major businesses, and different tools of human rights due diligence have been employed to help businesses identify risks across supply chains, tier one. Of course, I mean, a lot has been said about tier one and going beyond the tier one. And I think one thing, a message that was sort of clear was so far the level of investigation and understanding is probably limited to tier one, and a deeper understanding is, of course, very much required, but also a very complex one to achieve. Given our operations in South Asia of UNDP B plus HR Asia, we've conducted human rights due diligence in India, and in India we're really just starting the process. But of course, in Sri Lanka, my colleague has conducted quite a few many human rights due diligence trainings, and there've been some really interesting learnings from that that we've sort of been able to identify. One of the, of course, there's massive interest and intrigue in the process itself, also given so much happening across in the world globally, regulatory regulation-wise, whether it's the proposal of the EU directive or the Modern Slavery Acts in Australia or the UK. So businesses in South Asia also seem there's clear interest to understand what human rights due diligence is and how it would impact their businesses, and what, after all, is I mean, the devil is in the detail. Like, so what do we do about the process itself? So we've seen great participation from across South Asian businesses, but one thing that's been sort of realized over a period of trainings is while the nature of participants belong to a managerial level, and officers from various teams, whether it's human resource or CSR units or procurement units, and while they come and sort of participate with us on human rights due diligence and understanding it and unpacking it. One of the feedback also received is that once we go back to our own companies and our businesses, we're sort of lost as to how to actually embed the process within the systems. And that is where I think senior management buy-in and ownership at the very governance structure is something we identified needs to be the starting step, whether to a through a human rights policy, and that will then have a sort of a trickle-down effect in allowing the employees to understand and what one of the speakers said yesterday, wear a human rights lens throughout and not only limit to the human rights team in that particular business. So I think senior management buy-in, ownership, and setting the standards for human rights ethos of that company is absolutely critical to start the journey of human rights due diligence. Of course, another feedback that was received and is something that we continually observe is that the larger companies that have been who have taken the lead on human rights due diligence by developing human rights policies, and very good ones at that, have been rather cautious, and if I may say so, slightly guarded about what next vis-a-vis their human rights guidelines on business and human rights. And I think one of the reasons for that probably is that they also remain very, very aware of the high level of reputational risk that something like this could attract should there be any potential human rights abuse identified across their operations and supply chain. And I think I would really like to sort of make a plea like Emily did to the government. I would like to make one to the businesses, that I think it's important to understand that human rights due diligence as a process is not expected to be a perfect one-time solution. It is an ongoing process. It's very important to start the process, to consult stakeholders, external, internal, and sort of identify risks and find solutions on the way. It's not perfect science in that ways, and I think after all, I mean, it's important to understand that, like Dorothy said, I mean, it makes perfect business sense for you to sort of make sure that your operations remain human rights risk proof, and the best way of doing that is to sort of preempt the situation by sort of identifying it very effectively. And finally, a lot of the businesses that sort of engaged with us on the subject are largely the bigger companies, and like has been highlighted by speakers before me, it's rather easy. I mean, it's not easy. Easy is the wrong word to use, but it's imaginable for the larger companies because they have the resource and the capability to embed and uptake a human rights due diligence process. And some of them have already started that process and done a fantastic job at that. But the challenge really lies with the small and micro enterprises, something that Emily sort of really deconstructed really well. I'm not going to try and replicate that. But I think it's very important for the larger businesses also then to identify best practices and sort of help smaller businesses in sort of capacity building efforts and raising awareness on the subject, because after all, I mean, businesses and supply chains remain very, very connected to each other. So yes, Olivia, that these have been some of the major learnings for us from the region, and I'm looking forward to a lot many more learnings from India soon. Thank you.
Thank you, Nusrat, for sharing your direct experiences, for reinforcing the messages of Emily on the complexity of bringing in micro, small, and medium enterprises. Thank you for your plea to businesses themselves, for your reminder that human rights due diligence is not a one-time process, it is an ongoing process, indeed. And lastly, thank you for pointing out the importance of going beyond the do no harm and going beyond tier one. Thank you very much. I'm turning quickly to Harpreet for her to
And I can't hear you.
let me know how much time we have left on final.
Sure. So, Livio, we have exactly 17 minutes.
70 minutes. Okay, that's actually
17.
That's actually all right. That's good. All right, I've seen some question on the chat, but I'd like to first, if you can help me in seeing if there are questions from the floor there in Dhaka. I did the priority to them. Yeah.
Sure. Thanks, Livio. I see 3 hands raised here. So maybe we can start with the gentleman here and then we move here and then there. Livio, should we take all the questions together, or there are 3 questions from the floor here?
Take, all the questions, and please, those posing questions, be very, very short. So we have the possibility of asking more questions, and we give time, hopefully, to all the panelists to come back with a final remark or to answer one of your questions.
So please be brief in your question and or your comment.
I am Jose Mri. I'm coming from Madhupur, Tangail, for study. I'm the IP people, Karo people. Bangladesh government is planning to construct a lake on the land of IP and Madhupur forest area as a part of national park. Local IPs and environment will be affected from the lake, and the people, IP people, will be socially and culturally affected. Therefore, we are protesting this initiative. How could BHR Forum help us to protect our customer land in this regards? This is my question.
Sure. Thank you. Maybe here to wherever. I mean.
Thank you. My name is Rameswar. I represent Equidem, the Human Rights and Labor Rights Organization. So we work globally and locally. So we every day actually receive the cases from a migrant worker from our region to different part of the world. And those cases, while investigating and while analyzing, we find a big gap in the due diligence standard and the practices that has been practiced by the big companies, not only by the small companies. The recent example could be we launched a report on Dubai Expo. The Expo is the event where the world itself, 192 countries represented, and all the big companies in the world have represented. And also, it was the event where a good and robust kind of, there may be some gap, but a robust kind of labor standard was formulated and put together and made commitment that it will be implemented. At the same time, the government in the world, they have accountability to the business and human rights standard. But we found the cases in that big mega event that the worker from this region and other region poorly treated, and the abuses against them includes the abuses like discrimination and the forced labor. So I come to the conclusion and also the question is that, is there any capsule that those companies or those who have made commitment that we will implement those standards so that they can inhale that capsule and turn our policy into practice?
Sure. Thank you. There's a lady here.
Thank you. I'm very happy to hear with you. This is Chanchana Chakma. I am from Chittagong Hill Tracks, Human Rights Defender. I would like to ask the tourism, about the tourism in Chittagong Hill Tracks, which is, we have Rangamati and Bandarban, Sajak Valley, and Bandarban is one of the very famous issues in Marriott Hotel, which is under developing. It's for that indigenous people are in fact on the tourism because of indigenous people are going to lose their ancestral land, and Sajak Valley also 100 family, they have lost their land and they displaced from their places and they have no income source now. And even the girl, especially the indigenous women, are in danger because of they become a prostitute because they have lost their income source. And the Bandarban Marriott Hotel also, which is under the developing, that one also 1,000 acres of indigenous land they will lose, and they are spiritual indigenous spiritual and their ancestral land and everything. They are peaceful and they will lose everything. Then I would like to ask from the forum, then how can you help us to protection and prevention that issues? Thank you very much.
Sure. Thank you. Livio, there are maybe two more hands.
Let's take.
But perhaps let's just take these three questions first.
Very quickly, two more, and then I'll turn to the.
Okay, so we can
very quickly,
here.
Thank you so much. It's been lovely hearing from the panel from Home and Abroad. My name is Shahrin. I work for UNDP. However, I have quite a long experience working with youth and human rights in UNDP and also from Commonwealth. What I have been going through from the session, that's the human rights due diligence, particularly from the business sector and the private sector. Since from the South Asia, there are many young people, the employer are working in different private sector. So how they will be also being concerned and aware about that? Because for us in our country, in Bangladesh, the human rights due diligence in the corporate office, this is quite a new, you can say it's kind of an unknown concept for the homegrown companies, and they are actually, we can say, beating or submerging the other companies and the business environment in Bangladesh. So this is something from, of course, from UN perspective and also from the private sector perspective, how we can make the youth employers such a big youth community over South Asia to contribute to the due diligence issues for human rights. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Shahrin. Livia, maybe I'll hand it over to you on how would you want to address these questions to specific panelists?
Thank you. What I'll do, I mean, three of the questions look into pretty much keeping aside the specific individual cases, which we shouldn't necessarily go into. The three first questions are around accountability, of different actors, and also how can different actors help upholding rights of specific communities or workers or indigenous people. The fourth question is about the role of youth employers. Now, without necessarily assigning questions to specific panelists, I want to give the opportunity to each of them to come back for 2 minutes, no more than 2 minutes each, and I'll have to cut you if you go longer to make sure you all speak, to either respond to any of those questions or make any final remark or make any point that you wanted to make in your presentations that you weren't able to, or perhaps that you want to add based on what your colleagues have presented. Let me try to go in reverse order and perhaps start by Nusrat. So 2 minutes or less from you based on questions and comments. Nusrat.
Thanks, Livio. I'll just probably, because this is the South Asia Forum, and my second question was also sort of to talk about how South Asian governments can do, what actions can they take up to align to UNGPs in their respective economies. I think as a first step, South Asian countries, the National Action Plan on Business and Human Rights would be a key document and a key step in that direction. Pakistan already has a National Action Plan and taking the lead in the region. And I would really look forward to India, Nepal, and Bangladesh also sort of have concrete, strong national action plans with systems in place which can hold businesses accountable for their human rights impact, and also have robust access to remedy mechanisms inbuilt. Of course, I would also like to sort of take 1 more minute to sort of highlight the role of other stakeholders to sort of make the business and human rights agenda stronger for the region. Of course, there is a clear-cut role for market regulators in the region also to help further accountability of businesses. And of course, we've seen the Securities Exchange Board of India do a great job in mandating non-financial reporting on ESG parameters with the business responsibility and sustainability reporting framework. It is slated to become mandatory from 1st April, and that will give us quite a bit of information and insight into how well businesses are ready to report on ESG parameters and how human rights respectful they are in their operations. And of course, this will help to sort of chart the way for a balanced future ahead. And of course, business associations finally have a clear-cut role also with industry associations can play a great role in raising awareness amongst businesses in South Asia region. And here again, I think industry associations in India, Sri Lanka have begun the conversation on human rights due diligence. Sorry, I'm aware of the time.
Livio, you only have 7 minutes now.
Okay, well, then I'll have to ask the others to be faster. Thank you. So I give it right on to Emily then. Hopefully she'll be able to answer also the question on the workers, but over to you, Emily.
Okay, I just want to make I'm going to stick in my lane. I'm only focusing on workers' human rights. That's my area of expertise. But I want to make another impassioned pitch to you about the role of trade unions. Workers are, as human rights holders, are unique because they are in the enterprise, unlike other human rights holders. And they can speak for themselves, they can advocate for themselves, but they're stronger collectively through organizations, and they make more effective partners to management when they're organized. But that takes a couple of things. It takes good legal protection for workers to organize and recognition of those organizations by employers. But it also takes a commitment to work together, management and workers, because it does no good to have a company where the management and the workers are at loggerheads all the time. So that means capacity building, but it also means very serious industrial relations, which are a complement, but not quite the same thing as freedom of association and collective bargaining. Those are the rights, and the industrial relations are the machinery that makes a good management labor relations that are so critical for realizing workers' rights at work, but also that productivity that I talked about, because they are the key partner for management in improving productivity. If you don't have the workers on board, you don't have them committed, you're wasting your time trying to introduce lean production or some other productivity improvement. So I would just make a pitch that in their national action plans, there should be a commitment to also strengthen the position of trade unions as the voice of workers, to help build their capacity, help create peer-to-peer learning so they can learn from each other, because not all trade unions are at the same level of experience and some are still at that combative level that I want to avoid. So having peer-to-peer learning that can help introduce more constructive dialogue techniques as well can be helpful. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Emily, for talking about the absolutely critical role that trade unions play in this discourse. I'm glad we spoke about them because they have a very important role and we hadn't heard about their role yet today. Let me go then to Faziul for your final 2 minutes or 1.5, please, remark.
Thank you very much. I would like to say that this is a very appropriate time for some very concrete action in terms of developing human rights due diligence mechanism. Employers Federation of Pakistan has already recently developed due diligence mechanism on child labor for lower tiers in the cotton supply chain. And now we are going to work on developing a due diligence mechanism on human rights for business. And I think it would not be a bad idea if this forum, the South Asia Forum, considers to develop a due diligence mechanism for business in South Asia, because they will only reflect the current trend and current demands of the environmental shift, which has already started taking place, but it will be able to give them a very concrete shape. So it was just a suggestion I would like to float through this forum. And I think Pakistan is already working on it, but it could be a good idea if we could work it together. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much for being short, to the point, and making a very important contribution. Let me now turn to Mohammed Kabir Humayun, Joint Secretary, your 1.5 minutes also for your final remarks, and indeed if you want to answer questions posed from the floor.
Okay, thank you for giving me the floor again. Actually, the human rights and due diligence is getting more and more attention nowadays. Therefore, awareness raising is important. The Ministry of Labor and Employment is running 4 Industrial Relations Institute and 32 labor welfare centers to train labor inspectors, employers, and workers on labor rights. The training topic includes, but not limited to, violence, harassment, unfair labor practice, and anti-union discrimination in the workplace. Recently, we have completed establishment of a National Academy for Research and Training on Occupational Safety and Health. Bangladesh has ratified major UN conventions, including 36 ILO conventions, including all 8 fundamental conventions of ILO and the Protocol 29 to Forced Labor Convention. Recently, I'd like to mention that forced labor is constitutionally prohibited in Bangladesh. Bangladesh has also ratified 138, and to eliminate child labor, we have been implementing a national plan of action. We have recently adopted National Plan of Action with the European Union and a roadmap with the ILO on labor sector of Bangladesh. I think that with all these issues, we'll be able to get our awareness with the business communities and all labor officials and workers towards human rights and due diligence. It will be also helpful to get involved in dialogue with the business communities and the importing countries as well. Thank you.
Thank you for your important messages, Mr. Joint Secretary. Let me give the floor now to Jeremy, Deputy Head of the EU Delegation. Thank you once again, the Deputy Head, for being with us. 1 minute or 1.5 minutes for you for your final remarks.
Thank you very much, Livio. Actually, I was hoping to be able to get into a little bit more into details of this new directive on due diligence. But anyway, many information are available on the Commission's website, and then it's an ongoing process, as I was saying, and the Commission is as well developing a toolbox for companies for being able to implement this new due diligence directive. On the goals that the European Union wanted to achieve, I wanted to mention this before, but I forgot. The no harm culture has been mentioned, but by many of the panelists. Actually, we would like to that the new no harm culture be a new norm in offices and in boardrooms. But there are two more major goals. The one is for consumers to address their concerns when they don't want to buy products that are made with the involvement of forced labor or that destroy environment, and then to address the concerns of and then to support businesses in various ways to limit the patchwork of rules in the EU. I had in mind as well to present to you what companies are concerned, but by this law, it's around 17,000 companies, most of them big companies from the EU, 13,000 and 4,000 abroad. And this links me to the Bangladesh situation. It is quite probable that Bangladesh will be very much concerned by this new directive, not only because the brands are part of these big companies, but as well because textile and garment has been identified as the high impact sectors. So that's an ongoing process. I think that there will be a lot of discussion between the EU and the government of Bangladesh with the companies as well. And we are already having quite a lot of interactions. Humayun just mentioned before the National Action Plan on the labor sector, which has been concluded last year, who will already prepare Bangladesh a lot to be ready to be in line with this due diligence law. And then we have as well our colleagues from ILO know is very well a Team Europe initiative called Decent Work, which is putting together the EU and all this in all its member states. And finally, we have as well a business climate dialogue with the government of Bangladesh, in which one of the subgroups aims to explain what are the consequences of this new due diligence directive. Yeah, thank you very much for.
Thank you, Jeremy.
If you could really wind up, sorry, in 2 minutes, because I'm receiving messages from technical facilitators that we need to end.
Yeah, I will just thank Jeremy and certainly encourage the participants to go and look for more details on the upcoming norms in the EU, including by contacting our offices that will be able to facilitate that knowledge. So the last minute, I will give it back to Professor Dorothy to wrap up and make your last comment. Dorothy, the floor is yours.
Thank you, everyone. I'll do my best to wrap things up. It was a rich discussion, which I greatly enjoyed, but the reactions to the panel from the floor showed to me that there's certainly one common theme. I mean, how do we make human rights due diligence real in everyday business? And there are many guides, etc. But my perspective is certainly on the management practices, and I want to leave you with one idea, namely the integration of human rights in global supply chains does require longer term commitments from brands, and it requires longer relationships. Only if you're around for a while, you can actually establish the trust and the conversations needed to fully understand where the risks lie and how you can address them effectively. And so to me, I mentioned this, my hope that with the help of human rights due diligence, the approach to establishing fundamental human rights in global supply chains will become more inclusive and participatory, also more systematic and less sporadic as we've seen in the past. And as this trust between different layers in the supply chain requires time to grow, I would recommend to business partners to figure out ways to work together longer term. This is a condition that would give the implementation of human rights due diligence in its true sense a chance. So with this, I thank you all.
Thank you. Thank you for the perfect closing, Dorothy, and I'll give it back to Harpreet, not before having thanked everyone, the participants, and of course, panelists, and express my wish and look forward to unpack the many points made today that we haven't been able to deepen we'll have more forums, more conversations in the future with all of you and many more, to new conversations in the future. And with that, I thank you very much, everyone. Over to you, Harpreet.
Thanks, Livio, and thanks again to all the panelists here and who joined us online. And thank you everyone for being here with us. We would take a short break and be back here at 4:30 for the last session of the day on occupational health and safety in the post-COVID-19 world. We would start sharp at 4:30, so please try to come back in time so that we can finish on time. Thank you very much.
Recording stopped.
Yeah, it's like